Now, this is the second video in my series exploring or deep diving into how the new characters in the sequel trilogy have been used or handled thus far. This is not so much going to be their quote-unquote in-universe story, though since some of you have asked about that, I have considered doing a series like that, something very similar to my From Beginning to Endgame series that I did leading up to, well, Avengers Endgame, where I just went through the character's journey itself. And if that's something you'd be interested in, by all means let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's get on with the show here and talk about Finn. Easily, in concept at least, the most ambitious or potentially interesting character of the sequel trilogy. Now, why do I say that? Well, because he is, or could have been, a humanizing look behind the helmet, a glimpse at the otherwise nameless, faceless enemy known as the stormtrooper. And stormtroopers are usually fodder that gets shot down or blown up by the heroes without anyone ever really thinking twice about them. And that's because usually in movies like Star Wars, or at least the Star Wars saga films, you want who the good guys are and who the bad guys are to be very well defined and easy to distinguish from one another. Good and evil should be very easy to determine. You're not really looking for endless shades of gray in these type of movies. In Star Wars, we should know without a shadow of a doubt that the Rebellion or Resistance are the good guys and are made up of good guys, and that the Empire or the First Order are the bad guys made up of bad guys. And you never really want to call into question or draw attention to the morality of the hero's actions. For example, when Luke blows up the Death Star at the end of A New Hope, we're not really supposed to be thinking about the fact that he just killed a few 100,000 Imperials, and almost undoubtedly, not all of them to a man were evil. Then in the prequels, we never explore the question of, is it okay for the Republic and the Jedi to use a clone army to create living, breathing, thinking, and feeling beings to fight for them? Even though it's not only a question that should be asked by those in universe, but at face value, I think most of us would agree it sounds completely immoral to create people who are meant to fight and die for us. In other words, exploring the ethics of war is not the point of the main Star Wars films. Perhaps the closest thing we'll ever get to it is the opening crawl of Revenge of the Sith, where it says that there are heroes on both sides, evil is everywhere. Instead, the main films have always been about the triumph of good over evil and the cost paid by those who fight such battles. And I'm certainly not saying that Star Wars can't ever explore such things, or that it hasn't already. Rogue One showed us a different side of the rebellion when Cassian Andor shot an informant in the back. The Clone Wars animated series, to some extent, addressed the morality of clones being used to fight a war. In the very first episode of the series, in fact, we have Yoda explaining to a group of clones that he sees them as individuals within the Force, and it's actually one of my favorite moments in the whole series. So when, way back before The Force Awakens even came out, we heard one of the main characters was going to be a former stormtrooper, and we even saw right in the first teaser trailer that he was apparently going to turn or defect right in the movies, I was rather surprised and intrigued. Was this new trilogy really going to explore the idea that just because you're a bad guy or on the side of the bad guys, doesn't mean you yourself are a bad person? Was this going to be a character who had, against his will perhaps, done things he deeply regretted and was now looking for redemption? And we all know one of the core themes of Star Wars is, of course, redemption. So the more I thought about this character, the more I realized not only did he make sense or that he could fit beautifully into the story, but I was excited to see it unfold. Especially when it was teased he might be Force sensitive when we saw him wielding a lightsaber in one of the trailers. Because I then figured this was going to be someone actually seeking redemption, unlike Anakin Skywalker, who unintentionally earned it, at least in the eyes of his son, with one final act. But this new character, Finn, would be unable to find it or allow himself to feel like he'd earned it, despite how much good he might do throughout the trilogy in search of it, and even though he may become a Jedi or start to become one along the way. That his greatest challenge on the path of the Jedi wouldn't be having to learn to let go, which was the test Anakin failed, or learning discipline and having faith, which was the test Luke passed. But his challenge would be learning to forgive himself, to allow himself to become the Jedi he was meant to be. But wow, was I ever wrong about what this character would turn out to be. Because Finn wouldn't end up being a character in search of something. He would turn out to be one simply running away from something out of fear. He turned out to be pretty much a coward just trying to get away, but would end up finding courage nonetheless eventually. Which, no, isn't a terrible character archetype or anything. I just feel like it didn't offer as much to the story as many other routes with such a character could have, especially after seeing how the story has actually played out thus far. I mean, the first movie even goes out of its way to tell us that Finn has basically never done anything wrong or that he'd regret. that in his very first battle he refused to fire on defenseless villagers, which, yes, is a good thing, mind you, and makes him a good person all along, and that's fine. But again, there's far more for this character to overcome if he'd been, maybe say, a stormtrooper that was part of Kylo Ren's elite force under the command of Captain Phasma, and he'd been there for a while, which not only means he's done many shady things, that he probably had fired on innocents before and is now haunted by that, but if they'd made him a Jedi eventually, him having served directly under Kylo Ren and maybe having known him to some extent could have been used to create a dynamic between these two characters. You'd have Finn, who killed for Kylo Ren and hates him and himself for it, and we all know anger and hatred are not a Jedi trait, but we'd also have Kylo Ren, who never bothered to notice he had a Force-sensitive stormtrooper under his nose the whole time. Instead, outside of what we can only assume was a friend of Finn's dying at the start of the film, which seems to be what triggers him to want to run away, Finn doesn't have any sort of personal connection to the First Order. I mean, it'd be one thing if he mentions the dead friend at some point, and what that person meant to him and that he wants vengeance now, but he doesn't. He's just running from the First Order because they're bad and he's afraid of them. That's it. Again, he's more of a coward on the run than a character in search of something. And yet, The Force Awakens does try to sell us that there is some sort of rivalry between him and Captain Phasma, or at the very least that Finn really doesn't like her, which we see after they capture her and he's yelling about how he's in charge now, before she lowers the shields. But at least in the first movie, Phasma never gets the upper hand on Finn to add any weight to this dislike. As many have pointed out before, the traitor stormtrooper that Finn has a short duel with on Takodana really could have and should have been Captain Phasma, kicking his ass a little bit, and almost killing him before someone else saves him. The problem I have with Finn is the fact that he's a former stormtrooper really doesn't matter. He could have just as easily been anyone or anything else running from the First Order. He could have been a merchant or a bounty hunter who was in the wrong place at the wrong time or did something stupid and got captured and imprisoned, and then maybe meets up with Poe and the two escape together, and that's why he's so afraid of the First Order, because he has a reason to run from them. Him being a former stormtrooper seems to do nothing for the character, and only serves the plot when it needs someone to know how to lower the shields of Starkiller Base, or what the layout of a Star Destroyer is, like in The Last Jedi. Sure, it is nice and exciting that he does seem to overcome his fear of the First Order for the sake of saving his friend Rey. I'm not saying that's not an interesting arc for one movie. Problem is, it only works for one movie. And again, he could have been anyone terrified of the First Order who overcame his fear to save a friend. I mean, after he's done this, what's left for the character to overcome? Something new is going to have to be manufactured in the next movie, but as we know, that doesn't exactly happen, and I'll get to more on that in a moment. So staying with The Force Awakens, let's go back to the scenario I suggested before, that Finn was one of Kylo Ren's elite stormtroopers under the command of Captain Phasma. And on a side note, imagine if Kylo Ren and Phasma had been shown having some sort of bond, something similar to Anakin and Rex from the Clone Wars, that, like his grandfather, Kylo Ren cared about his troops and had rapport with them, or at least he pretended to. This way then Finn has a real concrete reason to fear the First Order, or Kylo Ren in particular, and to initially just want to run as far and as fast as he can. Because Kylo Ren is going to take the betrayal of one of his elite troops that he's served with for years very personally. Kylo will also, again, be mad at himself for not recognizing a Force-sensitive trooper right under his nose, and he likes to believe, like his grandfather, that he cares about and knows his troops. Nevertheless, Finn overcomes that fear of Kylo Ren to go and save Rey, but when he's almost killed by him, fear will turn to anger and hatred, both directed at Kylo Ren and himself for having served under him for so long and doing his bidding. Thus, Finn's story arc for the rest of this trilogy has been set up, and it's essentially about trying to forgive himself as he seeks a way to earn redemption, and despite everything else good he'll do along the way, he'll think killing Kylo Ren is the only way to actually earn it, and vengeance is of course the path of the dark side. Instead, Finn's story arc in The Last Jedi seems to be learning about capitalism and war profiteering. He's also a part of a useless side quest that not only fails, but is the reason why the secret plan of Holdo's fails. You know, the plan to, after traveling through deep space for hours and slowly running out of fuel, to finally pass by an inhabitable planet, and then to secretly land on it and hide there without the First Order ever being the wiser, without them thinking to themselves that the Resistance might try something just like that, considering the only other option they have is to just run out of fuel and get blown up. And let's also never mind the fact that the First Order can track ships through hyperspace, but wouldn't be able to see a small group of ships, neither visually nor with their scanners, leaving the one ship they've been chasing for hours as they make their way down to the planet. I love the fact that the First Order is seriously under the impression that the Resistance is going to do absolutely nothing to try and survive. Anyway, sorry for getting a little sidetracked. My point is that Finn's role in this movie, The Last Jedi, is to go on a side quest that ultimately ends in failure and spoils the plan that should have ended in failure anyway, because it was nonsensical and relied on the First Order being complete idiots who never considered the Resistance may have an actual destination, that being Crate, and a plan once they got there. Not only that, but Finn is saddled with a brand new character, Rose, when he could have and should have gone on a side quest to get fuel or save the fleet somehow with Poe, a character he'd had great chemistry with in The Force Awakens. However, Rian Johnson said he didn't want to put Finn and Poe together because they did get along so well, and he didn't think there'd be any tension or conflict between them. And he does know he could have added outside tension, right? Or maybe you keep Rose in the movie and have both Finn and Poe interested in her, and they both know the other is interested, and you create tension between the two that way. All the while, as I've suggested in other videos, you have this trio being pursued by the Knights of Ren, which gives them a place in the movie too, because the First Order has a spy aboard the Resistance ships, which is how they're being tracked. And somehow, while on this side quest, Poe, Finn, and Rose figure out who the spy is, get the fuel, and save the fleet, and Crate never happens. Because, meanwhile, Rey would be taking Kylo Ren's hand and joining him, thus giving us real tension going into the final movie. But alas, Rian Johnson was too worried about tension in this movie to realize he should create some for the next one. Anyway, let's get the focus back on Finn and what actually happened in the movie, because there was still a way to do something memorable with him in this film, and that was to let him crash the speeder into the mini Death Star gun and to go out as a hero. The coward who had ran away from the First Order and initially only wanted to save himself was now giving his life to save others in the hopes that they could be defeated someday, the First Order, I mean. But nope, we couldn't have that. Instead, Rose comes out of nowhere and saves him. And we'll just never mind the fact that none of the ATs were able to shoot down either Rose or Finn, despite the fact they were the only two speeders left on the battlefield, or that they were both able to walk back to the base without getting shot. In closing here, Finn feels like such a wasted character in this trilogy. If you're going to go big and have a stormtrooper turn, then do something big with it. Make it a real part of the story and give this guy a worthy arc. Don't just have it where he runs, finds the courage to face his fears, then in the next movie is only concerned about Rey, before he then makes the decision to give his life for the cause, only to have that hero's death taken away from him at the last second by a character who also doesn't serve the story. As for him in the Rise of Skywalker, sadly, I'm not expecting much out of Finn. I think it's cool that J.J. Abrams is going to put the three new main characters, or main protagonists, together in this movie finally, but I feel like so much of this film has to be devoted to developing whatever the main plot is going to be, that you're not going to have time to explore Finn all that much. Again, we should just be thankful to have him with Poe again, even though the two get along so well. And maybe someone should tell Rian Johnson that there have been plenty of stories where two dear friends with no inner conflict between them whatsoever worked exceptionally well. One such example would be Sam and Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. And never mind how in the movie Frodo sends Sam away at one point. Doesn't happen in the book, shouldn't have happened in the movie. But anyway, there was no reason that Poe and Finn couldn't have had that kind of friendship in this trilogy, that The Last Jedi couldn't have built that up, setting up something where one has to give their life for the other in the final movie perhaps. Instead, Finn needed to learn about slavery, animal cruelty, and capitalism, and Poe, well, we'll get to Poe in a future video. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about Finn and the way he's been used in this trilogy. Have you been disappointed, or do you think he's been great thus far? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.